She said it like she'd been deciding whether to say it for the entire evening. Not loudly. Not the way you'd say something you were certain of. She said it the way you say something you have practiced in your head until the words stopped feeling like yours, and then you say them anyway, because the alternative is carrying them home alone again. She was standing at the bottom of the staircase with one hand on the newel post and the lights in the caf all turned off behind us except the one above the counter, and she looked at me like she wasn't entirely sure I was going to stay. I stayed. What happened next is not a short story. It is the kind of thing that takes some explaining, because the woman in question is not a simple woman, and the caf is not just a caf. And the evening that ended with her whispering those 5 words to me began about 3 months before that. On a morning when I walked past a handwritten sign in a window that said, "Help needed." No experience necessary, just show up and made a decision I cannot fully account for. I am, on balance, glad I made it. My name is Owen Farrell. I'm 36. I left a comfortable job in urban planning about 18 months ago under circumstances I will describe, with some charity toward myself, as a controlled departure. I had the savings, I had the flexibility, and I had, if I'm being accurate, a mild crisis about whether the life I had built was the life I had meant to build. I moved back to the coastal town I grew up in, with the stated intention of figuring that out, and the unstated intention of avoiding figuring anything out for at least 4 months. The sign was in the window of a place called Marin's. It was a caf on the harbor front, one of those buildings that feels like it grew out of the ground rather than being constructed on it, with green painted window frames and a chalkboard menu, and small round tables that had no chairs matching any other chairs. The kind of place that could only exist because one person had made every decision in it personally, over a long period of time. Her name was Maren Voss. She was 38. She was Danish originally, which explained the name, and she had been in this town for 12 years, which explained everything else about her. She had bought the caf with her husband, Peter, a quiet man by all accounts, a marine biologist who had worked out of the harbor. He had died 11 months before I showed up, suddenly and without warning, of a cardiac event at the age of 41. She had kept the caf running through the winter on what I came to understand was pure forward momentum. If she stopped, the grief would catch up, and so she did not stop. When I walked in off the street, she was standing on a stepladder fixing a light fitting, and she looked down at me and said, without preliminary, "Can you make coffee?" "Competently," I said. "Not brilliantly?" "I wouldn't promise brilliantly." She came down off the ladder and looked at me for a moment, with a measuring expression that I would become very familiar with. "Competently is fine," she said. "Brilliantly is my job." She had a small scar above her left eyebrow from a childhood incident involving a bicycle, and a confidence she has described as retrospectively unjustified. She wore her hair tied back with whatever came to hand. A pencil, a length of kitchen twine, once a pair of headphones she'd forgotten were there. She kept a running list in a notebook behind the counter that was half orders, half observations, half things she needed to look up later. A notebook already full beyond its stated capacity, operating anyway. We shook hands. She told me the hours. I showed up the next morning, and she corrected my coffee technique in the first 10 minutes, and I said nothing, because she was correct. The work was not complicated. Mornings were busy, the harbor crowd, the regulars who'd been coming for years, the tourists in summer who found the caf by accident and treated it like a discovery. Afternoons were quieter. She baked in the back during the quiet hours, cardamom rolls on Tuesdays and Fridays, a honey cake on Saturdays, whatever she felt like during the week, which was usually something she'd been thinking about since the previous night, and described to me when I arrived, in detail, with a focused enthusiasm that I found, consistently, and without any rational justification. Very difficult to look away from. She talked about Peter sometimes. Naturally, the way you talk about someone who is still entirely present in your life, even in their absence. She'd say Peter always said the Thursday crowd was more interesting than the Friday crowd, and he was right, or he chose that painting. I told him it was too melancholy, and he said that depended entirely on how you looked at it. She said these things without breaking stride, without inviting comment, and I listened without offering any, because it seemed like what was needed was not my response, but simply for the sentence to be spoken aloud into a room where someone would hear it. I repaired a shelf in the back store in the second week, because it was listing and she'd mentioned it twice. She came in and looked at it and said, "You didn't have to do that." I was here anyway. That's not the same as having to. She looked at the shelf for a moment, and then looked at me with something that was not quite gratitude and not quite suspicion, but something in between that I filed under things I don't fully understand yet. October arrived, and the tourist trade thinned, and the mornings got cold, and she started closing earlier. The ritual of closing became its own thing, wiping tables, stacking chairs, the particular silence of a room that has been full of people all day and is now emptying itself back to quiet. We did this together without discussing whose job it was. And some evenings we'd sit with the last of the coffee for 20 minutes before she locked up, and some evenings we wouldn't. One evening in late October, I noticed she wasn't moving at the same speed she usually did. She was slow with the chairs. She stood at the window for longer than the window required, looking at the harbor. "It was his birthday last week," she said, without turning around. I kept thinking I'd handled it, and then I didn't. I didn't say I was sorry. She'd heard sorry 11 months running, and I had come to understand that sorry, however genuine, lands eventually like another weight rather than a hand. I said, "What would he have wanted for it?" She turned around. The question had surprised her. "He'd have wanted the calf full," she said, after a moment. "He loved a full room. He said it proved something, a room full of people choosing to be in the same place." She paused. I should have opened anyway. I didn't. "You'll open on the next one." She looked at me steadily for a moment. "That is a very calm thing to say. I've been practicing calm. Is it going well?" Inconsistently, that got a real smile from her. Small, but present, like a light in a room where someone has quietly opened a curtain. November came in with high winds and a leak in the back kitchen that I spent a Saturday morning fixing while she baked around me with the equanimity of someone who had decided that inconveniences were simply part of the landscape of a place she loved. The notebook behind the counter grew 2 new sections. She started leaving me a coffee ready when I arrived in the mornings, the way she made it, without asking if that's how I took it, because by that point, it was how I took it. I was, if I am being honest with myself, an unreliable narrator of my own situation. I told myself I was there because it was useful, and because I'd needed something to do, and because the work was satisfying in a physical, uncomplicated way I'd been missing. I told myself she was a person I was helping through a difficult year, and that what I felt when I walked into the café in the mornings was simply the satisfaction of a routine that had meaning. I told myself many accurate and entirely insufficient things. Her sister called once while I was there. She could hear the conversation from across the room, not the words but the shape of it, the Danish rising and falling. The particular short laugh Clara made when her sister said something she was pretending to disagree with. When she came back out, she looked lighter, briefly, the way people do after something familiar. "She wants me to come home for Christmas," she said. "Are you going?" "I haven't decided." She set the phone on the counter. "It feels like leaving. The calf will still be here." "I know." She looked at me for a moment in the way she sometimes did, that measuring look. but softer than the first one. It's not the calf I'm talking about. I did not know what to do with that sentence. I put it away and did not take it back out for 3 days, at which point I took it out and examined it very carefully and told myself I had probably misread it. I have mentioned I am an unreliable narrator. The closure notice went up in the 3rd week of November. She told me first, before the sign, before she told the regulars. She told me on a Wednesday morning when the calf was empty between the morning rush and lunch, standing at the counter with her hands wrapped around a mug, and she said it the way she said most difficult things, directly, without preamble, watching my face for my response before she'd finished the sentence. I'm closing at the end of the month. Not permanently. A few months. Renovations, or... No, that's not true. She stopped. Corrected herself. I need to stop. I've been running on empty for a year, and if I don't stop deliberately, I'll stop accidentally, and I'd rather choose it. That sounds right, I said. It doesn't feel right. Those are sometimes different. She held my gaze for a moment. Her fingers tightened once around the mug. I don't know what to do with you, she said, not unkindly. In terms of, when I close, you won't need to. You've been here for months without taking anything like a proper wage, and I don't know how to. Clara? She stopped. I didn't come in because of the wage. She looked at me. The calf was very quiet. Outside, the harbor wind moved across the glass. I know, she said, softly. The last evening was a Friday. We'd taken down the chalkboard menu and the artwork she was putting in storage and the small framed photograph from above the counter. Peter and her on the day they'd opened, paint-stained, laughing at something just outside the frame. She wrapped it carefully, and I held it while she taped the edges, and she handled it with the kind of attention you give something that contains a great deal. We cleaned. We covered the counter and the espresso machine. We moved through the room together, and it felt, in the way significant things sometimes do, both ordinary and entirely not. When we were done, she stood in the middle of the empty calf and looked around it. The one light above the counter. The chairs upturned on the tables. Gerald, all the mismatched chairs. She breathed out slowly. He would have made a speech, she said. He loved a moment. I always told him it was embarrassing, and he said I was wrong, and he was right. She paused. He was right about most things. Not all things, but most. She looked at me then, and she held my gaze for 1 second longer than felt safe. And she said, quietly, almost privately, like it was a sentence intended only for the space between us, "Come upstairs with me." She said it like she'd been deciding whether to say it for the entire evening. I said yes the way you say something when the answer has been there for a long time, and you have simply been waiting for the question to arrive. Upstairs was the flat she'd lived in for 12 years. The one above the calf. The one she'd shared with Peter. The one she'd kept coming back to every night for the 11 months since. She made tea. She sat in the corner of the sofa and I sat at the other end, and she told me things she said she hadn't said out loud yet. About the year, about Peter, about what it felt like to keep walking into a room someone used to be in. I listened without trying to fix any of it. There is a version of love that is simply being the room where someone can say the true things, and I understood by then that this was what she needed first. At some point the tea went cold. At some point she said, looking at her hands, "I didn't ask you up here because I'm finished grieving. I want you to know that. I'm not. I don't know what the right timeline is supposed to look like." "There isn't one," I said. "How do you know?" "Because there isn't one for any of it. There's just what's true, and when you're ready to say it." She looked up. "And are you ready to say something?" she asked. I told her that I had walked past the sign in October without any plan and stayed for 3 months and repaired her shelf and learned to make coffee her way, and that at no point during any of it had it occurred to me to leave before I had to. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm glad you showed up. I'm glad you let me stay." She leaned across the sofa and kissed me once, carefully, like a question I had already answered. Her hand was warm against my jaw. From below us, the café settled into its overnight quiet, all that space and mismatched furniture and the ghost of cardamom still in the walls. She went to Denmark for Christmas. She came back in January. The café reopened in March with a new coat of paint on the window frames. The same green, but fresh, and a menu that was mostly the same but had 3 new things on it, all of which she developed in the months away. The photograph of Peter went back above the counter, in the same spot. I asked her once if that felt complicated. She thought about it for a long moment and said, "He would have liked you. He had good taste in people. That was one of his best things." I didn't have an answer for that. I'm not sure one was needed. 2 years later, when people asked how we came to be together, she said she'd needed someone to help her close a chapter, and the wrong person would have tried to close it for her, and I'd understood that it was hers to close. I said I'd just shown up because of a sign in a window. She said, "That's not the romantic version." I said, "That's not the same as it not being true." She looked at me the way she'd looked at me across that empty café, the light on above the counter, the room quiet around us. Nothing important had appeared overnight. It had simply stopped hiding. What would you have done if someone who had been through a great loss whispered an invitation you weren't expecting? And have you ever shown up somewhere without a plan and found exactly what you didn't know you were looking for? Tell me your story in the comments. If you liked this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.